Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture on literature into film. In this lecture, I'm going to be giving a very brief history of film, and then I'll be talking about how film has narrative structure and what some of the similarities are between film and literature. In this lecture, you will see several links that will not be hyperlinked within the video text. You can access these links by going to the PDF and then clicking on those to view the short examples of films that I've embedded into this lecture. This history of film that I'll be discussing in this lecture is intentionally brief. This is not a film class, so I will only be giving you a very small background and an introduction to some of the early films that were recorded. The reason is that we're going to be focusing more on adaptation. So I encourage you to take a film class if you're really interested in the history of film, and you can find out a lot more about how films developed over time. So the early photographic experiments that were in photography in particular lead to the development eventually of motion pictures. The first film is created in 1877. It's made to capture the motion of a horse. So if you look at the PDF document and you're able to click the link within D2L, it'll take you to a modern update of original footage. Mainly the modern portion is some of the editing and some of the, well, really all of the background music that is put into this film. The original would have been silent, and it would have been just the portion where the horse is shown running. You can distinguish that portion from when they slow it down to show you how the horse's feet actually lift fully off the ground. This was something people never realized before slowing down a motion picture and really looking at the way the animal moved. So motion capture was really the purpose of the early footage that was seen there, to look at the horse and to discover the way that it was moving. Films were then projected beginning in the 1890s. So it took, almost 20 years in order for people to begin looking at film as something that would be entertainment. Early films were short, usually about 1 minute, and they were typically about everyday scenes. Some were candid, meaning they were captured as they happened, and some were staged, like a play. In fact, many early photographs were staged with costumes and theatrical backdrops to capture a sense of fantasy and to look at the way that staged elements could be incorporated into photography. Early films did this same sort of thing. However, the one that I've linked for you here, the Round Hay Garden scene, is a more candid capture of almost like a family party where people are walking around a garden. Now you're seeing people think about how film can capture everyday movement and people's lives rather than just looking at something in terms of capturing motion. Film begins to move from being a novelty to a full-time business, beginning in the early 20th century. Silent films were made until 1927 when sound was first introduced, and the first sound picture was called The Jazz Singer. Early films started with a stable camera, no camera movement, and little editing. You can think of it almost like a photograph, but with people moving inside of the frame. So any motion that was happening was not from the camera being moved, but from people or animals moving within the frame. When we're looking at how film developed at the turn of the century and into a business, the first thing we can notice is that in the 1890s, filmmakers started to tell stories with the images by using sequences of scenes instead of one stable shot. So think about already how much this is evolving very, very quickly, from just capturing motion to people moving within a staged frame scene to now beginning to think about how can film tell a story. And these different elements of how film can tell a story will begin to connect it to literature. These early stories, however, were not literature quite yet. They focused on experiments in camera technique, in editing, and in creating a narrative structure. So the narrative structure means showing events unfolding or happening in time. So a beginning, a middle, and an end. That should sound very familiar at this point, connecting all the way back to our first week in the class when we talked about the teleological narrative structure, movement toward an end, and how that connects to human identity. So when we have this new form of storytelling, people immediately start to put it in some type of structure because that's how grounded the way that we view the world is in terms of time, right? In terms of telling a story and narrating an identity. This quickly became one of the ways that people began to structure film. And you can see a couple early examples of this from A Trip to the Moon in 1902 and The Little Darling from 1909. And again, you can click those live links within the PDF document on D2L. As people began to understand what film was capable of and how it could be used as a storytelling vehicle, the films that were created began to get more elaborate. They began to include more than one scene rather than just setting a camera up and having the action happen within the frame. They would begin to build larger sets, switching between scenes, developing more acting and more continuity from one scene to the next. This would mean that the camera would change positions or that the scene behind the camera would shift, and there had to be connections between the different scenes in order for the story to make sense. So continuity is the film industry word for stability in the narrative story that's told. The basic understanding of cause and effect so that there's a connection between scene changes that makes logical sense throughout the story. And you can see an example of a more sophisticated action film in The Great Train Robbery from 1903. This is going to show you the evolution of how differences in scenes, larger sets, and more developed acting began pushing the way that films were being developed into more storytelling vehicles. So as we begin to think about film as storytelling, we can look at some of the elements that tell the film's story. So rather than just a print text where you're getting all of the words and having to create things in your imagination, film uniquely tells stories through things like lighting, mise en scene, which is what's actually within the frame of the camera, editing, music, camera angles or camera tilts or camera movements, and choices made by directors, writers, and actors. So in film, it's not just what happens on the screen or the plot, but we're also seeing that story come to life. What we are shown affects our understanding of the film's meaning, and different directors or different actors in certain roles actually contribute to the way that we interpret the story. So all of these elements go into the way that we are understanding what the story is supposed to mean, and all of these things bring a unique and different perception of the story than what we might get through just a print text. Now, because we're living in the 21st century, we're actually very sophisticated in terms of the way that we view films and understand films because we grow up watching TV and films and we have a good sense of intuition about how films are created and structured. But of course, when film began, these things were not just taken for granted the way that we do when we view them. More sophistication was developed as time went on, and now the things that seem sort of taken for granted when we watch films were actually really innovative at the time. Some of these developments include flashback sequences. You should probably recognize this pretty easily as when a film might be at a certain point, it cuts backwards in time to show you how you arrived at a certain point or maybe to reveal certain information. That wasn't something that was done in original films. People had to think through how can we tell maybe part of the story out of order rather than starting at the beginning, going to the middle, arriving at the end. Let's think about how we can make the story more interesting or more unexpected, and a flashback was one way to do that. In terms of camera location and angles, we also got point of view shots. This is where you see the action from one character's perspective, as if you're looking through their eyes. In that sense, the camera is not positioned at the front of the room, so to speak, looking out on the action, but has now become part of the action, and the camera is showing you something and putting you in the actual world as a participant rather than as a spectator. That sort of sophistication and technique changes our feeling about what's happening in the film. You also have things called reverse angle edits, where it shows the scene from two different angles and the action can appear differently. This will help you understand a fuller sense of the action as a viewer and giving you different perspectives. You also have in editing an innovation called cross-cutting. This shows us what's happening at different locations during the same time period. So all of these techniques are ways that time and perspective are manipulated within film so that you're able to see and understand more depth and more complexity in how a story is told. As film continues to evolve, the techniques also continue to move from just those on the technical side in terms of time and editing and cross-cutting into more symbolic imagery and mood decisions in terms of tone. These techniques begin to approach the style of literature because what you've got here are things that are being used in order to ask the audience to interpret rather than just to receive the information. Those elements include things like symbolism, where certain images are used to represent ideas, establishing shots that create a sense of tone or mood. Usually these have to do with environment, such as a stormy night might indicate the feelings of the characters. Or if a film is shot entirely with darkened tones, then it would imply some kind of scary or upsetting environment rather than a film that might take place at a beach or out in the sunshine, giving us a sense of happiness. You also have the director being portrayed as a type of author, where the choices that the director makes in terms of style, lighting, editing, who's playing different parts with the actors, these are all equated to writing the story of the film, like an author would write a text. So the director gets to choose what type of tone, what type of symbols, how the actors are portraying, and begins to manipulate and control a story much in the same way that an author would control the writing of a text. So when you have film begin to adopt many of the characteristics of literature, it's a natural evolution that directors and actors would begin to look to literature and to literary texts as a source for film. And that's really what we're going to be talking about in this week's text, is this process of adaptation, of taking literature and using film to tell the same stories. Many texts are very difficult to adapt because of their mode, their style of writing, or their perspective. The screenwriter or the director has to decide how to present a work that was originally meant to be read and originally meant only to be visualized in the mind. The choices made in deciding how to adapt literature into film create completely different texts of the same original book or story. Interpretation is made by the director as well as by you, the viewer. So it's a different type of interpretation, obviously, because you're being asked not just to read and create the images in your mind, but to actually see what the director interpreted and to decide if you accept that vision of that literary world. And we'll be talking about some of the complexities of adaptation and how differences between what the viewer views and what the director decides and how those may contrast and cause problems as well. We'll also see that the process of adaptation between literature and film will bring up similarities between the way that film works and the way that literature works in many of the ways that we've studied already this semester. For example, like literature, some films remain open-ended, and you have to decide what they mean. Other films, most films, have very definite conclusions. They're bringing you with movement, teleological movement towards an ending, just like literary texts do. Films are also made in different modes or genres, and they can be made just for entertainment, for example, like blockbuster movies, or to present you with serious messages or lessons. So all of these things in terms of purpose and structure are very similar to the way that literature functions. And that's why film is housed within the Literary Studies English department, is because that underlying sense of narrative structure is what really controls the way that the story is presented. So telling stories has become what film is really all about, and communicating those stories involves adopting a narrative structure that is very similar to that of literature in many cases. So because of this overlap, the storytelling that happens between texts and films has become very closely aligned. I've listed here the Wikipedia page for novels that have been adapted into films because so many novels now are written almost with film in mind. A lot of authors don't really separate their stories from the idea that perhaps they could become film. And many contemporary authors admit to writing novels with the idea of eventually having them as film stories. So where previously filmmakers were looking back at older stories and thinking, how can we adapt these? Now filmmakers are working with many novelists and writers to actually option rights for the books before sometimes even the authors finish writing them. So it's a much more collaborative sense of writing where the person is creating both a novel and a film at the same time. That's not true for all of them. There are many original screenplays that were never novels, but many texts become films eventually because of that idea that narrative structure can then be translated into film. So some of the things we can begin to ask ourselves as we think about this process of how film has evolved from stable pictures into sort of strange telling of stories within a frame to the more sophisticated storytelling that turns it into a type of literature, we have to ask ourselves, has film taken the place of reading? What is at stake when reading a novel or a story versus seeing a film? And you can think about your own preferences as a way to start thinking about, what do you prefer? Do you prefer reading? Do you prefer watching film? Or do you have a combination of those? And then don't just take those answers for granted, but ask yourself why. Why do you have those preferences? And we'll be thinking about that as we go throughout the rest of this unit. Thanks.